Welcome. We are thrilled to have you joining us today for a special live webcast presentation. My name is Chelsea Domenico, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast focused on practices around workplace harassment, diving into the results of the 2018 BELA Workplace Harassment Survey. Over the next hour, you'll hear from my colleagues here at Ethisphere as we share with you the findings from company responses and that the data was developed from the survey. You'll also hear insights from our Business Ethics Leadership Alliance, BELA, that you'll commonly hear throughout today's webcast, member Nokia, as she shares her insights as well. If you've ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know we love to take your questions and answer them throughout the presentation today. Our goal for every webcast here is to encourage you to ask as many questions as you have. We'd love to make this more engaging and possibly more of a conversation with you. So please use the question feature within the webcasting platform. And we do anticipate a handful of questions coming in from the floor today. So if we do run out of time, we will try and answer those with you and follow up via email. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from us, including the recording of today's live webcast and PowerPoint presentation. You'll also be receiving the report to the Workplace Harassment Survey as soon as it becomes available. In addition, Ethisphere recently partnered with Everfi to publish a special report on the Me Too movement, in which you'll receive that as well. I will quickly introduce our speakers before turning the floor over to Erica. I'd like to welcome Tish Clyde, VP Global Employment Counsel at Nokia, as she's joined by my colleague Scott Stevenson, Senior Analyst with Data and Services team here at Ethisphere, as well as Erica Salmon-Byrne, Executive Vice President and the Executive Director of BELA. Erica, the floor is now yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Chelsea, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody, depending on where in the world you might happen to be located. I'm delighted to be presenting the results of this survey, and I'm especially pleased that we have Tish on the line with us. As Chelsea mentioned, Tish is VP Labor and Employment Counsel at Nokia, and Nokia was actually the BELA member that pushed us to do this survey work. So I'm particularly pleased to have Tish on the line with us to say thank you to Nokia for encouraging us to do this survey work, and then also so that she can share her insights. She leads the team at Nokia that is accountable for shaping the global HR legal agenda. As you guys all know, Nokia is a large multinational company with over 100,000 employees in more than 120 countries. So Tish has tremendous insights into the way some of what the data is telling us is actually shaping company practices. Quick note on the agenda for today, because we are going to have a busy webinar. We're going to talk for just a moment about why we chose to do this topic now. We will then, my colleague Scott Stevenson, who's on the line with us, will talk a little bit about the survey methodology. What did we see in terms of the response rate? Who's in the data set? How long do we run the survey for, etc. And then we'll start diving into what we actually found in the data itself. And what you will get accustomed to is a back and forth between Scott and myself on the data points and Tish on the company color. And as Chelsea mentioned, please do chat your questions into us. We really do take seriously that we want to have questions, that we would like to hear your thoughts and try to make this, it's always hard with the webinar format, but try to make this as interactive a conversation as we possibly can. Okay, so why this topic and why now? You know, as I mentioned, the team at Nokia was one of the BELA members that specifically pushed us to do this particular work. And a lot of it was driven by the fact that, you know, the Me Too movement, as it emerged over the course of the past year, started as a media and entertainment focused conversation, but has pretty quickly grown to impact a lot of different sectors. And what we began to hear from the community was that it was very difficult to really get a sense of what was happening across peer organizations when it came to what sort of volume companies were seeing. Was there an uptick in sexual harassment, for example? Was there an uptick in what in some countries is called power harassment, or harassment situations where the harasser is a supervisor or a superior to the individual that's experiencing the harassment? And you know, just the challenge of getting a sense of whether or not what a company is experiencing is normal was really one of the things that drove the original impetus for this survey. And one of the really interesting things that we found, and Scott and I will talk a little bit about this in the data as we move through it, is in many cases when we sent the survey link out to the community, we sent it to the people that we primarily interact with, all of you, compliance and ethics professionals and others that are in the ethics and compliance function inside of organizations. And for a lot of people, we got a response that this data and this information was solely the purview of human resources. And not something that the ethics and compliance function necessarily had access to unless something had come in through the helpline. And in many cases, the survey link went over to HR, and we got responses back that HR didn't want to participate for whatever reason. So I do think one of the things we'll talk about, and part of the reason I'm delighted to have Tish on the line, is the challenges associated with bifurcated responsibilities for this topic, and how do you effectively coordinate across those divisions. So with that, Scott, if you want to cover just a little bit on the methodology of the survey. Oh, thank you, Scott, actually. This was a last-minute inclusion into the deck. And it pertains, I think, to part of the reason why we ended up doing this survey. So this is a statistic from our culture quotient data set. One of the questions for those of you who have done culture survey work with us, we ask, did you observe misconduct? And then if the person answers yes, they get a series of follow-up questions. And one of the follow-up questions is, what kind of misconduct did you observe? And what we found in there is that harassment or discrimination is the most common type of observed misconduct across the data set. 38% of those who observed misconduct selected this as the type of misconduct they observed. And the people who observed this kind of misconduct were more likely, 25% more likely, to say that the reason they didn't raise it was because the individual involved was senior and that they didn't think anything would be done. And so I think that is another key factor that plays into why so many of you are spending your time and energy and giving your attention to this particular topic these days, because it is something that is frequently observed and not necessarily frequently reported. So Scott, with that, if you want to just talk a little bit about what we ran and who's in the data set, and then we will get into the data.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erica. So we ended up making this survey available to the entire BELA community through August 28th through November 2nd. We ended up gathering roughly 112 usable responses. To give you a sense of the breakdown of the organizations involved, 71% of these are publicly traded entities, and 74% have employee populations that exceed 10,000 or more employees. We were really pleased with the turnout and kind of the diversity amongst the organizations in this. We have 14 industries represented, and 92% of these organizations recognize annual revenues globally of more than $1 billion. So it's a range of organizations that participated, and so we were tremendously excited at the data that we received. So Erica, I will jump into the first data point, fair employment policy.
So one of the first questions we asked in the survey, just to get a baseline, was the extent to which the individuals participating, the companies participating in the survey data set, maintain a standalone policy as opposed to just including language in their code of conduct on fair employment practices. And 80% of the data set indicated that they do maintain such a standalone policy. And of those policies, 98% of them specifically address harassment and sexual harassment in the course of that policy. Now, one of the things we've seen a lot of companies doing over the course of the last year is looking at ways in which they need to tweak or update their policies in response to some of the trends that we're seeing globally. And so with that, I'd like to pull Tish in for the first time into this conversation. Tish, from your perspective, what might drive a company to make those changes to a policy, and what really makes for a good written policy in this area?
Oh, great question. First of all, Erica, Stuart, and Chelsea, thank you so much for inviting me and for agreeing to do the survey on this subject, because it is, I feel, super important. I'm also extremely pleased to participate in this webcast. What I would like to invite is all of the members who are on the call today. I am super interested in benchmarking, in learning from you, getting your feedback and ideas. And so in addition to submitting your comments or questions during this webcast, do reach out afterwards if you'd be interested in a follow-up discussion. It would be tremendously helpful. So after that quick plug, I will answer your question, Erica. I find this response quite interesting because I've just gone through an exercise, even though I'm in legal, of simplifying. We at Nokia have 38 global HR policies, and frankly, nobody could find them or knew them or could navigate through them. And I've just pulled them together into one global HR framework. So I really am in the camp of believing that including whether it's harassment or fair employment practices within a code of conduct at Nokia is the right place to have it. It's our absolute, kind of rules of the road that we live and die by, and sets our ethical standard. And so I'm not convinced that having a standalone policy helps, although you can see here I'm clearly in the minority. So I'm interested to know, what other people find is a benefit from it. What I can say in terms of your question about what makes a good policy is clearly around having a common definition, understanding about what do we mean by harassment, not just sexual harassment, but any form of harassment. Because I had a case, just to give you a real life example, very recently, where we had a person come to me and said, I don't think this is harassment, Tish. I think this was normal behavior, but I've been chatting with a colleague who said I should talk to you. So I said, well, what is this behavior? And the woman said to me, well, my manager keeps asking me to stay late after work, and then sits next to me and puts his chair too close to me, and it makes me feel extremely uncomfortable. And this is a kind of a classic case where this person really didn't, understand that it was perfectly okay to say, you know what, that makes me feel uncomfortable, that's not right. And so I think a policy is extremely important, or the content of it, to get that, alignment, that clarity around what is expected from every single employee and line manager in terms of behavior. Now, of course, that's just the start. It sits on a shelf. You have to have a culture, and we'll come on to talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting, Tish, one of the things that we are seeing, if you look at a lot of member company codes of conduct, is a section in the code on the way we treat each other, right? So there's a common sort of expectation of behavior in the workplace, but then we are still pretty commonly seeing cross references out to a more detailed policy. And it'll be interesting to see, sort of where that particular trend goes. The simplification trend that you just mentioned is absolutely something we are seeing companies do, trying to make it as easy as possible to help employees find the guidance they need to make good decisions. But de-lawyering the policies as much as possible, if you will. But it is interesting to see that there's a group of companies that have moved away from a standalone policy and presumably have all of their content in their code of conduct on this particular topic. And I'm curious, anybody listening in that has taken that route, please do chat us and let us know, because it's I do think it's an interesting approach. The code is the easiest to find document for a lot of companies, and so if you can get everything in there without making it 13,000 words long, it certainly does make it easier for employees to find.
That's right. I mean, I think in your report, you call out the example of Netflix, who have a standalone and ban flirting, staring, hugging, and any sort of romantic overtures. Now, I have to say, good luck with that one, because it's just, you have to take into account culture and the relationships that people have are very different country to country, but also just, in terms of, people, how they interact at what level and so forth. It's all about, to me, behaviors. And there are so often gray areas. I think the much bigger challenge, of course, is bringing that to life. How do you create a company culture where, in our case, we call it respect, and where people really understand what respect looks and feels like.
Yep. And so some of that goes into figuring out what's actually happening across your business, right? So Scott, if we go ahead and jump to the next slide, if we look at the particular categories of concerns that are being tracked by the organizations, we see, of course, the biggest, the largest categories here at the top: discrimination and harassment. Those are pretty common tracking categories, followed by retaliation, bullying at 83%, and then we sort of drop off from there with labor issues being at the very bottom of the chart. And the question here is really trying to get at what specific types of complaints are you breaking out and tracking separate from other types. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at in terms of the tracking component. And we do, thank you so much, have a question from the floor. Thank you for sending it in. So Tish, I'm going to actually interrupt our flow here and ask this question because it's a really good question. And the question is, how can we define a common understanding of harassment when you operate in so many different countries and cultures?
It is a great question. And I think where we've come out on that question is to look at, go back to our values. We've got 4 of them. And in our case, we think that respect, one of the 4, is where we then say, wherever we are in the world, and we operate in 120 countries, more than that, these are the types of behavior in terms of how you interact with people. And the CEO, and he's just recently done a video for me because we're very fortunate to have strong leadership. Tone at the top is critical. And he talks about it in very simple terms. What he says is respect is about listening. It's about constructive challenge. It's about ensuring that everybody feels heard and that you take into account people's different opinions. You respect different cultural boundaries. But he said, you know what? When you are treated with respect, you feel it. But more importantly, when you are treated not with respect, then that stays with you for a long time. And he said, that's not what I want Nokia to be. So I don't know if that really answers your question. It's not a detailed definition. That's why for Nokia, we framed it within our values rather than have a standalone definition of harassment or definition of sexual harassment outside of how we want people to interact. We include it within that.
Yeah, and I do think that's really solid advice, Tish, because for a very long time, the definition of harassment was grounded in the legal definition of harassment in the jurisdiction in which you were operating, if there was such a definition, right? That was sort of the lawyers controlled the defining in a lot of ways. But I think if you are operating within a company that has a firm set of values that is well communicated, so I want to give both of those caveats first, right? It doesn't really work if you tie it to a value that people don't necessarily know already. But if you can tie it to a definition of here's who we are as a company, and this is the way we interact with each other, I do think that becomes an easier conversation.
I'm in violent agreement. So the only time I ever use the legal definition, the only time, is when I'm on an investigation, a disciplinary committee, and we're looking at the facts, and then I get some line manager telling me, but Tish, there's no proof that line manager X, tried to kiss, this was unfortunately a real life case, a subordinate 2 levels below. And then I will absolutely, say, well, that's irrelevant. And I also don't think it's helpful necessarily using a definition of, let's talk about what do we mean by hostile work environment, and was the conduct wanted or unwanted. And as we know, many jurisdictions now are even taking away that distinction, because it then gets into a legal argument. So you're right to raise that point, because I think it is an important one. It's not that I'm not saying, or that it is important that we know the legal definition and that we have that in our background, but I haven't found it helpful in the work context. Certainly not at Nokia. Yeah.
And I think it also depends a little bit too, and Tish, you touched on this with your comment about the investigation context. There's a cultural component to this, right? Are people comfortable in their work environment? And that is as important, if not more important, as the legal component, right? Did somebody violate the law? Because if you have somebody who is, to use the example you gave earlier, staying late at work and has a supervisor who is crowding into her personal space in a way that makes her uncomfortable, that's a productivity and employee morale issue before it's anything else. And that is, something that needs to be of concern to the company as well. Oh, and we got another question that came in from the floor. What is mobbing? It's a great question.
Oh, mobbing. Okay, this is very interesting. So mobbing is quite a European concept. It is basically akin to bullying, to power harassment, where somebody feels that they are being put under, too much pressure. And I see a strong, I can't say correlation. It's not, it's not a statistically significant correlation, but I see a connection maybe between power harassment and other types of harassment. For example, in sales organizations, which are very typically macho, very results orientated, and quite we want that, and yet, at the same time, that quite often or can create a context, an environment where there is that power harassment or dynamic happening. It's by no means limited to the sales arena. We see it in many other places. In fact, that's our number one highest number of complaints. But when you dig in, very often there is a component to that power harassment which is related to gender, sexual orientation. It may be culture. One other just point to note on mobbing is in that some countries it's a criminal offence, and there's also very substantial damages and for mobbing.
Mm-hmm. And so, Tish, for those of us who aren't as familiar with the term, does mobbing necessarily connote more than one individual involved, or can it often be individual to individual?
It can be absolutely individual to individual, or it can be in a group.
Perfect. Okay, great. Tish, any thoughts on the fact that only 59% of the companies in the data set are separately tracking labor issues? I wasn't surprised by this because of the differing nature of people's workforces, but I didn't want to overlook it before we move on to the next slide.
We track it separately in Nokia. I'm not that surprised either, because typically companies have other mechanisms to track labor issues. I mean, I have you've either got unions and works councils, and then you know where your disputes and your issues are, and where you don't, but you might have. And by that's how I define labor issues, or we define it in Nokia, just in case anybody defines it differently. And where we don't, which is, in many countries, particularly in Asia, then we have other mechanisms to track. But we do anyway, because we just don't want to miss out.
Right, absolutely. So breaking out that 93% that specifically track discrimination, the follow-up question we asked was, what types of discrimination do you specifically track? So The most common response was harassment, including the different varieties of harassment, gender discrimination, race discrimination, sort of, as you can see here on the chart, kind of scaling down with pregnancy discrimination being at the very bottom of the list. And I do find that interesting. And Tish, I wanted to get your thoughts on, anything that you see in these various degrees of breakouts, and, what's the value from your perspective of breaking out these various categories? What does the company get with differing levels of tracking?
Yeah, well, I'd be interested, anybody on the call who, disagrees with this, split. I have to say that I was surprised on the hostile work environment came out at 76% myself, but that's just my own personal view. I mean, when I joined Nokia in the back end of 2016, there was complete separation between HR and the rest of compliance, and we didn't track any type of HR compliance concerns except in one bucket that said HR. Well, you can't really do much with that data. You have everything piled in from, I hate my boss, to, I don't think I'm paid enough, to, everything. And so,
somebody stole my lunch.
Yes. I think it is, I personally find it extremely helpful to separate out. We have 10 different categories that we track. I think also it depends how you're set up in terms of investigating concerns. If you have HR, which we do, investigating complaints that come in, then it helps them, because the most common issue, and I know we're going to come on to this when it comes to investigating concerns, is correctly identifying what is the issue, what the complaint about. Is it about sexual harassment or power harassment or discrimination or equal pay or whatever? And very often employees don't express it in those terms. And so HR really needs to think about and talk to the reporter to understand that. And having the separate categories very simply helps HR go through that thought process. So I find it extremely helpful. It also gives me the data that I don't have to then spend time on that, and I can get more into the analytics.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a tremendous amount of sense. A question that came in from the floor, Tish, just to make sure that everybody's sort of operating from the same definitional place. Is power harassment limited to sexual harassment by a superior rather, or are there other things that fall into that bucket?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, in my view, in my definition, power harassment can absolutely be between one colleague and another. It may be cross-functional. It could even be, I've even had a case where within the same team, somebody who, thought that, it was in this case a woman, was, had more, influence with the other members of the team. So power harassment can be on the same level very often, or I would say typically. There is normally a seniority disparity between the two people.
Mm-hmm. So power harassment literally means a power disparity between the harasser and the harassee.
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily have to be seniority.
Yep. Yep. Another question that came in from the floor, Tish, on this tracking piece, before we move on to percentage of cases and some of the stats on that. Once you track the instances by the category, what do you guys inside of Nokia, what do you do with that information, other than reporting out by category? Do you use it on trending? Do you look at training differently? Kind of what do you do with the tracking info?
Yeah, I like that. This is a real challenge. We have a quarterly governance meeting, so I get the head of the CHRO, me, the head of compliance investigations, a couple of other people. We look at all the data, then we go, and that tells us just, the types of claim. We cut it by region, by country, by business group. What else do we cut it by? We do comparators by quarter over the previous year. We look at cycle time. So we look at a number of data points in our dashboard. Then we get into the qualitative data analysis, where we look at consistency in disciplinary actions. So we then look at the cases where which were substantiated. We want to make sure we've got consistency in the disciplinary action that we take. We look at the factual the fact patterns that we're seeing. We look for trends, and then we think about, well, what is that telling us about our culture? What is that telling us about what remediation we need to take? And then we develop action plans, and then we track those actions quarter by quarter.
Got it. So let's dive just for a second into what the data told us about reporting. So this was sort of the heart of what's happening inside of organizations that are tracking these various categories. So this was a skip logic question where if you indicated you were tracking by category, you got this follow-up question. And what you see here on the screen in front of you is 2 data points. What percentage of total cases reported constituted fair employment matters? And you see there's a real range. You've got not quite 23% over on the right-hand side, indicating that it's greater than 45% of their cases were fair employment matters in some way, shape, or form. 20% indicating that it's somewhere between, a greater than a quarter, but not quite a half. And then the largest percentage, 27.3%, indicating that it's a smaller component of their total caseload. So if you add those 2 numbers together, the most commonly chosen response was less than 15%, somewhere between 1% and 15%. Tish, did you have any thoughts on sort of looking at this overall breakdown? If this was something that surprised you, or was this pretty consistent with what you were expecting to see?
So I was surprised by this, and I wonder, and maybe anybody in the call might want to comment, whether this reflects sort of visibility across the board to all of the concerns raised, or maybe just the visibility to HR concerns. Because in my case, for example, I don't get to see all of the concerns raised in Nokia, the bribery and corruption and so forth, health and safety and those. I don't look at those. I don't have the visibility to them. So I would not have the view. Now I have, in preparation for this call, looked at the numbers, and we actually, our HR concerns, our fair employment practices, are about 48% of our total number of concerns raised this year.
Mm-hmm.
So I was surprised by that.
I think it's a very fair point, Tish. If one of the things that we hear repeatedly when we talk to companies about their overall reporting numbers is the challenge associated with maintaining multiple reporting systems, multiple systems that track the information. So, there is still a substantial percentage of companies out there where human resources tracks human resources related concerns, and the compliance and ethics office tracks the things that come in to them. So so I do think that is a piece of it. One of the statistics that we'll share in a moment is, at most organizations, human resources is still very much in charge of any fair employment related issues, and so it lives very much inside of human resources, and it can be hard to really get your hands around the data. Now, one thing we are hearing from a lot of companies is that component of it is changing post the Me Too movement, as boards in particular are asking for a more robust and holistic view into what's happening across the business as opposed to individual separate reporting lines. If we run this survey in a couple of years, we might find that it's a different situation. But I do think that's one of the challenges associated with, looking at these issues and trying to do some trending, is the fact that it can be very hard to get your hands on the data.
Yes, I agree, but it is changing. I mean, our board absolutely wants reporting post #MeToo on fair employment cases, And I'm seeing now more and more the presidents of the business groups also wanting it included. So yeah, I think it's not going to be too long before we'll get there.
Yeah.
I don't know what other people think, but.
So Tish, we've gotten a couple great questions that have come in from the floor. One is around calibrating discipline. And so the question is, for discipline calibration, have you experienced any challenges with that because of changing standards for current discipline versus historic matters, either because of reputational risk or changing standards? Are things being addressed with greater discipline now than they have been in the past, and is that a calibration challenge, or what have you experienced with that?
Oh gosh, it's a huge challenge. I had a case recently where there was, the manager was appalled that I was recommending termination, and I am not kidding you. He said to me, but when I talk to this guy, I'm sure he will get the message and he won't do it again. And and I think he genuinely believed that in the past that was okay. I had to, put him right on that. So there is a challenge in that standards of behavior that I believe wrongly was somehow acceptable are not. And I so welcome it. When I first read about, Harvey Weinstein, and I thought, well, that's fantastic. I'm great and very good, if you're in the movie industry in California. But what about somebody working in Dunkin' Donuts or, a Tesco retail store? And it was when I saw the case in McDonald's that really I felt that the world has changed. And the other aha moment for me was doing a round table in places like China and in Singapore, in APJ, and hearing employees, talking about the movement and how they wanted to see these changes. And so I think it's remarkable, and I think it's that's why I'm very, very concerned that I have all my line managers in Nokia, wherever we do business around the world, understanding how the world has changed and what behaviors are expected.
Yeah, and Tish, we're going to get into manager training in just a moment, because that is so critically important. One of the things that we see when we look at our culture data set is most often the person that you go to with a concern is going to be a manager. And if that manager decides to handle it themselves, without the involvement of ethics and compliance, without letting the legal team know that it's going on, just sort of takes it on of their own volition to address it, the potential risk to the company is, so substantial in those circumstances.
Right, but I think the bigger cost, and I think it's in your report, it's a hidden one, and you mentioned it earlier, Erica, around productivity. I think that's had a detrimental effect for however long. Companies have quietly ignored it. I think the other cost is unwanted attrition, because it's much easier to walk than to put up your hand, and I think that's what we've seen.
Well, and we saw a very public reflection of that in the recent walkout at Google, right?
Yes.
I'm sure that the cost of those hours of not only just the hours of people being out of the office for the walkout, but all of the organization and noise and buzz and everything that went along with it. That was I'm certain that was not the way Google wanted that to go.
Right. But you see it in many other companies. I was talking to one of the European general counsel at Uber, and they've had some challenges in this area, and it's taken a huge toll on engagement and productivity.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Tish, one question that came in from the floor, and thank you everybody for being so engaged. I love the fact that we're completely off of our flow and, only on slide 12.
Sorry, we need to speed up, sorry.
No, this has been fantastic. I love it when this happens. So another great question that came in from the floor is tracking near misses. So there's perhaps insufficient information to substantiate a particular claim or concern because there's a lack of proof, or the individual, doesn't want to be a known reporter, or whatever the case may be, but the investigator senses that something needs to happen. Either additional training, or this is an area that we need to keep an eye on, or maybe we need to get somebody from another part of the business to come and take a look at what's happening within this particular division. Do you guys do any of that, Tish, right now? Do you sort of look at why was a complaint not substantiated, and should we do something anyway?
That's a great idea. I'm going to be honest to say we don't do any follow-up now, but I'm making a note because I think we should do. In another case, again, quite recently, we had a manager in Italy acquire a new team from Greece, and there was, quite a few kind of team building activities, new team coming together, and so forth. And out of that, we had a complaint raised for sexual harassment against the Italian line manager, and we didn't make a finding in that case of sexual harassment, but the line manager clearly needs coaching. It's one of those cases where it was partly cultural. He was sending WhatsApp messages late at night. They were personal. They weren't sexual. He was trying to, said he was trying to build a rapport, and that's how he did with all of his team, inviting them all for dinner and so forth, and embracing them when he saw them. And so we didn't actually take disciplinary action on the facts, but it's one where he's got coaching. He will have coaching. I'm concerned about the follow up. So yeah. I think it's a really great point. We should build that into our process. So in those types of cases where it's a little bit borderline, we are kind of have some mechanism to close the loop.
Yeah, and we are seeing companies start to explore that specific practice. There's one BELA member that is doing a little bit of a root cause analysis on unsubstantiated cases to ask what caused that person to raise their hand. So there's sort of a cultural lesson in the fact that even though it turned out to be nothing, that somebody still had the courage to ask the question. And so that's one thing that we see happening, and then. I do think we're going to start to see more and more companies looking at that unsubstantiated, quote unquote, near miss, sort of borrowing that practice from the safety context.
Yeah.
And then another great question that came in from the floor, Tish, and I may save this one to talk about a little bit more in depth when we get to the manager training piece. But how do you think about sharing stories? So how do you demonstrate to employees that you do take reports of harassment seriously without violating privacy? How do you walk that line?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest and say we haven't nailed that one. I think it's so important, one, because stories is what resonates with people and brings it to life. We do currently do a sort of quarterly compliance blog for all our employees. Of course, we anonymize, we share, highlights and so forth, whether it's cases within Nokia, sometimes it's cases in the tech industry. We have so far not done it for HR cases, and I think it's a real miss. Here's what I'm struggling with. So all ideas welcome. We know that what changes people's behavior is not the stick. It's not, a cigarette packet that says you will die if you smoke. That the research is pretty clear now that positive reinforcement changes behavior. So, I get through my door, and you've probably seen this podcast, to say, hey, this is your energy consumption, Tish. You're on green, but do you know, in your neighborhood, you are a mediocre compared with somebody down the road who's got, a gold star. And then I'm thinking, hang on a minute. I'm quite good, but you know what? I'm going to beat that. and we'll maybe come on to it in training. I think that is the key, is to show people what good looks like, and then hold everybody accountable to that standard in a way that is motivational.
Right. Yeah, we've seen some companies take culture survey results where, particular employees indicated that they absolutely trust their manager as an ethical leader and will go to them with questions. And, those particular managers have scored on those metrics above the company benchmark. They've gone and figured out sort of which business units are those managers in and what are they doing so well, and asked those managers to start to teach other people in the business. Which I think is an interesting practice.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide, and then I will pause for a couple of minutes and take some more questions, because the great questions are continuing to come in, which I love. Back to tracking. So these were the two categories where 60% of the respondents indicated that they don't get this granular in their tracking process. They don't specifically track sexual orientation harassment claims, and they don't specifically track power harassment related claims. Tish, what are we missing by not tracking these specific categories?
I don't think we're necessarily missing that much if the investigation is done well, because it comes out through that process. That said, I'm very interested in sort of sexual orientation. We don't split out, we split out power harassment and other forms of harassment, but we don't go into, is it culture, is it age, what kind of other harassment it is. We just say, is it harassment? But, I think great. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not a good thing, but I don't think it matters.
Yeah.
Far more important is that it is investigated. And we had the situation in Pride Month in June, where we had a number of concerns raised around LGBT plus, and it did make me think whether we needed to track it separately. But because we have our analytics piece in the governance, we deal with it that way. So I'm interested whether it helps other companies, and if so, how. We just don't do it.
Yep. No, absolutely. And you mentioned this a little bit, Tish, when you talked about the investigation. So, Scott, if you could jump to the next slide. One of the questions we asked, we were curious who has responsibility across the business for investigating harassment-related claims, and not surprisingly, the vast majority of companies indicated that responsibility was human resources responsibility. And one of the other questions we asked was, have you seen an increase in sexual harassment related concerns since the rise of #MeToo? And 80% of participants indicated yes, they have definitely seen an increase. And so I think this raises the question, Tish, of how do you coordinate effectively with HR if there's cultural or behavioral related concerns that are coming up inside of investigations that are being run completely by a different part of the business, or if there's overlap, for example. I think that's a question. And then we got a great question from the floor about closing the loop, which is, once a discipline decision has been made, give a written warning, for example, how do you keep it from falling into the abyss?
Oh, that is a good one.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, so I'll come back to your question. So we've basically seen a double in number of concerns raised in the last year, 2018 versus 2017, and that's a good thing. I mean, frankly, this is one where I want a trajectory that only goes up. because I think it's really indicative of the health of our compliance program, the health of our culture, when more people come forward and raise concerns. So that I'm delighted with. By the way, I still think we're too low for the size of company that we are. In terms of doing the investigations, HR does them. We had a real issue when I joined around quality of the investigation, the reporting, completing the NAVEX tool. And so we then embarked upon a training. And one person on my team, bless him, did training WebEx for all of HR, an hour and a half, 7 sessions, and it was death by PowerPoint, and nothing changed. And we realized that really wasn't the way. So what we've done is we've selected in each region in the world a small group of our HR, from our HR team, and we have I've gone kind of to many countries in the world to train them, and we do it all around a skills-based, real-life case scenario. It takes a day. It's in a safe environment. They get to role play. They get things thrown at them that they're not expecting. They get a chance to practice interviewing, looking for data. And then, they come out and they were in teams and so forth, and there is a right answer and a prize. So we found that has been far more successful in the quality of the investigations. We then have the governance. We then also partner. So I get involved personally or one of my team, on all harassment concerns. And I will review all of the reports. We also then partner with the compliance investigations team on complex cases, so that they have HR has a coach or somebody that they can partner with and build their skills. I don't think it takes a lot of time, though.
Yeah.
Tish,
go ahead, Scott.
And Tish, this is Scott, obviously. One of the questions I'm hearing from BELA members, and I work with them sending data that they incorporate and report up to their audit committee, is that increase you mentioned, you've more or less doubled in the claims. Do you see that as a sign of healthy culture, or how do you view that in
healthy
kind of
culture.
A positive or negative way? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's great. It means that people are feeling comfortable speaking up. They are feeling that it's important, that we think that management, that Nokia feels it's important that people speak up, and that if they are, if they are not happy with what's happening to them in the workplace, that they have somewhere to go. I think it's only positive.
And so what if you coupled, when you report that up, the natural objection is kind of, okay, we've seen an increase in these types of claims, that's problematic. When you're communicating that up, what have you sort of coupled that information with to really explain and highlight that it is a sign of healthy culture?
What I couple it with is, well, what are the cases that are actually finding? If I'm doubling the number of cases, but actually, I'm reducing the number of cases which are substantiated, well, in a way, that's a good news story. If it's a reverse, not so much. So I think it's the really important thing is what is, and this is just one data point, by the way, the number of concerns that tells us what the culture is like and whether it is healthy. But when you combine it with other data points like the employee opinion survey, like attrition, we use a number of different data sets to give us, our business case for what we want to do. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
no, it does, certainly.
Tish, I don't want to lose sight of this sort of how do you make sure the discipline actually happens question, because I think it's a really, really good question. And we've gotten a follow-up on it from another attendee on who gets the final decision rights on discipline. So, is it the business unit? Is it, is it the investigator? So how do you guys think about making sure that recommended discipline happens, and who's got the say on that?
Yes. So we give the investigator, so it's normally the HR person, the ownership to follow up to make sure that the warning letter is issued, if the person is terminated, that happens, that the coaching happens. The investigator owns sort of closing out the actions. In terms of who makes the decision, we are still grappling a bit with that. We have disciplinary committees, and we did this big acquisition 2 years ago, and there were different practices, and we haven't quite got somewhere where certainly I'm comfortable with, because we want the line manager to have accountability. However, if the line manager is left to his or her own devices, the subject of the concern is a high flyer, got a case at the moment, then the line manager is doing everything he possibly can to save this individual. And it's human nature. So we always make sure that we have compliance, we have HR, we will have somebody from the business who's in the region, not the line manager. And if it's any kind of harassment case or anything that's sensitive, I join. And then the line manager has a voice, but does not have the final say.
Yep. I think that's very much in line with what we see a lot of companies in the community doing, making sure that the that particularly for the harassment related cases, that it gets out of the place where the decision will have the greatest financial impact.
Right, but if one half of the business excluded the line manager from the disciplinary committee or the decision-making committee completely, and I think that's a mistake, because then what happens is the line manager just goes up the chain and goes, this is outrageous, this decision's been taken and I don't agree with it, and it's unfair, and it's blah blah, and they have to take accountability somehow. Now occasionally though, where we think it's in particular fact cases, we will remove the line manager and we will just invite the 1-over-1 manager to be involved in the decision making.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So I do know we're at the top of the hour. Tish, do you have a few minutes to sort of wrap up the next topic? And then anybody who's on the line who has to drop, you will get the recording as well as the slides.
For sure.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and jump to training, because, we've touched on this a little bit during the course of the conversation. Obviously, one of the critical preventive measures that companies are looking at is how do we actually change behavior across the business. And obviously, the larger the business, the harder that can be. So we asked about particularly who is getting training, when does that training happen? Are you training your managers? And what we found is, what we tried to do here is we tried to discount a little bit for those jurisdictions where sexual harassment in particular training is mandatory. States like California and Maine and now New York that require the training. And yeah, Tish, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. Most of the training that I have seen, I'm not sure that it's engaging in behavioral impact.
Yes, I'm with you. I've been benchmarking with other companies on training and what's effective. And, without naming the company, I can't take any credit for this, but it's one multinational that I think has come up with a great way of training. They segment, so they do a number of different types of training. They will do one-on-one sessions. They also have training for groups who are working freelance or I don't know temporary labor. But what they've done is they put together a game. Now it sounds a bit frivolous. I notice in the report there is a category of people who use games. but games are fun. And they put together a game with the easiest way to describe it is like traffic lights, red, yellow, and green. And then they have developed these sort of scenarios on cards, very simple, about 100 of them. What I really like about this approach is it's global and local. So I'm a line manager. Line manager takes responsibility for having these conversations, doing not training so much as conversations with his or her team. He looks at the cards and says, okay, I'm in the US, okay, my team is in the US, so I think cards 1 to 10 are going to be more kind of suited to the cultural environment, the type of situation that my team is in, versus I'm operating in Russia or in China or wherever. So you can select cards, you can make it local, the line manager owns it, it's quite fun, I've played it, and you then and you can do it virtually, which in our case is super important, as well as in person, and you can build it into your team agendas. So I really like that approach. We're looking at it, we're going to build it, and then we're going to roll it out in 2019.
Yeah, that's a great approach. There's another BELA member that took on the opportunity of a meeting with, I think it was the top 200 leaders across the business. Maybe it was a little bigger than that. And they actually took real cases from the company with the real actual language used that came out of the investigations and had a local acting troupe act them out.
Yes.
In front of that audience. And
yeah.
And a lot of people who thought there's absolutely no way anything like this is happening in my company were very taken aback by some of the things that were being said and some of the things that were happening. And they took that experience with them back to their regions and shared those stories.
I think that's super powerful. I mean, I'd be interested at, others' ideas, but there is increasingly, certainly using real life stories, but actors who can bring it to life is becoming increasingly popular. And I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. And then I think that the question for folks to think about, after that is both, how are you reaching all your different levels of managers? And then how are you figuring out what's working, right? So are you tracking reporting statistics? Are you tracking access to company resources? Are you looking at whether people are following up with some of these different pieces? We've seen some companies start to use their internal audit team when they're out in the field. They have a couple of sort of culture policy awareness type questions that people ask, the auditors ask when they're out in the field. Which can sometimes, at least get you some interesting anecdotes, if not data. And all of those things, sort of give you a sense of whether your program is dynamically keeping up with the business.
Yeah, so we're setting our baseline with our mandatory training in the beginning of 2019. And we're going to get, that's going to be our baseline. And then our KPI we're measuring, we will do, through our employee opinion survey and question that we insert there. To see how we're doing to measure progress ongoing, because you're absolutely right. You've got to measure progress, otherwise you've got nowhere to go with your leadership team. No, you just what gets measured gets done. People really want to be able to see the health of the organization and the culture. So I think you do need to measure it. That's the way we're going to do it.
Yep, I agree 100%. Well, Tish, I cannot thank you enough for not only taking the time today, but taking a little bit of extra time. And thank you so much to those of you in the field listening that joined us today. As Chelsea mentioned, you'll get a variety of follow-ups. You'll have the slide deck and the recording from today. Some of the written thought leadership that we've done on this topic that we've been releasing over the course of the fall, and then we are putting the final touches on the report itself that will incorporate all of this data, as well as some of the truly fantastic questions and suggestions that have come in via the chat function. This I think this may have been our most active audience ever, which I think tells us something about just how important this topic is. So Tish, thank you, and thank you to the Nokia team for encouraging us to do this research project in the first place. It's really been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody. Bye.